in this hyper-polarized political environment, psychedelics were one of the very, very few topics that received several bipartisan bills in Congress. I don't think any of them ever went through, but there was bipartisan support for these bills.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president of the New York Academy, and today I'm delighted to welcome Nicolas Langlitz. Nicolas is an anthropologist and historian of science, currently teaching as a professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research here in New York. He's also the director of the Psychedelic Humanities Lab at the New School. Langlitz holds both an MD and a Ph.D., reflecting his interdisciplinary expertise spanning medicine, anthropology, the life sciences, and the history of science. His dissertation, entitled Neuropsychedelia, the Revival of Hallucinogenic Research Since the Decade of the Brain, was made into a book and published by the University of California Press in 2012. And his most recent book is entitled Chimpanzee Culture Wars, Rethinking Human Nature alongside Japanese, European, and American Cultural Primatologists, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. So, Nick, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Glad to have you with us. And perhaps you could give a little bit more nuance to the introduction I just gave by telling us how you happened to first be interested in doing an MD, then became involved in what I understand to be the anti-psychiatry movement, and then decided to come to Berkeley and do a PhD in a very different kind of field, albeit around some of the same questions that you were preoccupied by earlier.
So I went to medical school after having read too much of Michel Foucault's work. I had been interested in neuroscience and psychiatry basically since high school and was considering a career in one of these fields. But at the same time, I had also begun to read Foucault's The Birth of the Clinic and Madness and Civilization and the work on the history of sexuality and so on. And I was trying to figure out whether I should go into biology or psychology or medicine to ultimately pursue a degree in neuroscience. And eventually I thought, given that Foucault had convinced me that medicine would be a philosophically interesting place to be, I opted for medicine. And I started medicine and philosophy at the same time at Freie Universität. The day when I showed up on campus to enroll, I went over to the philosophy department, and there was a flyer there by a anti-psychiatric group, which was planning to organize a Foucault tribunal on the current state of psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, great, that's exactly my field of interest. And so I showed up for the first meeting of the Foucault Tribunal, and it was a complete circus. There were sort of radical social science students, psychiatric survivors. It was a raucous scene. And at the end of that first meeting, I decided I'm definitely not going to participate in creating this Foucault tribunal, but I think I want to continue to follow it. And I joined a medical student, student magazine, and started to follow them journalistically and interviewed the person who was running this anti-psychiatry group and interviewed the director of the psychiatric clinic, who was their arch enemy because he was a proponent of electroconvulsive therapy. And later on, I also reported on the tribunal itself, which was ironic because Foucault hated Maoist show trials, and actually his partner Daniel Defer was there and was pretty appalled by the whole thing. So I was never an anti-psychiatry advocate. I basically, came to be an anthropologist, I would say, without knowing it at that point when I was interested in this, and I was interested in the conflict they were having with the biological psychiatrists, and I tried to, adopt a detached observer position and understand what's going on and what the politics were around this activism.
So you finished the MD.
Yeah, I finished the MD. I wrote a dissertation at the time in the History of Medicine department on Lacanian psychoanalysis. Um, that was also a primal scene of sorts because I I knew Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory a little bit from philosophy classes because it was popular among post-structurally oriented philosophers. Um, I wasn't really thrilled by it, but I was interested in what form psychoanalysis took in Paris in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which was a period that I found interesting philosophically. Um, but I also wanted to know how this very esoteric theory translated into a clinical practice. So the dissertation was on Lacan's practice of variable length sessions. And that practice had led to a massive conflict with the International Psychoanalytic Association, which insisted that psychoanalytic sessions had to take 50 minutes because patients were paying for 50 minutes. They should get 50 minutes. And Lacan countered that ending a session should be a meaningful intervention in its own right. And he was eventually excluded, and with him his entire organization, which at that point was the uh, largest psychoanalytic organization in France, which basically led the sort of French psychoanalysis on a path that was separate from that of international psychoanalysis. So I wrote that history, um, and I also did some work in biological psychiatry at the time, just because I wanted to um, be able to still have a career in that field, but it was interesting, but compared with writing the medical history dissertation, I thought it was uh, pretty bland. And when I was done with medical school, I had decided I'd rather try to keep going in the medical humanities. And so I applied for the PhD program in medical anthropology at Berkeley and got into psychedelic research as an ethnographic field from there.
So yes, so tell us a little bit more about how you decided to work on psychedelics and how you approached the question of psychedelics when you were doing your PhD research. This was in the aughts that you were at Berkeley,
Yeah, mid 2000s.
mid 2000s.
And so there were different threads. I mean, I so while I was working on the dissertation in history of medicine, I took a seminar at the Institute for History of Medicine on the history of self-experimentation.
Hmm.
And we read Kurt Behringer's Der Mescalinrausch, which was a book from 1927 by a phenomenological psychiatrist who was self-experimenting with mescaline and was encouraging his residents to also self-experiment with mescaline, although I guess one can ask questions about whether that's still a self-experiment. and artists and other sort of literary intellectuals, and he was trying to get like a broad range of phenomenological accounts of the masculine experience, which he considered analogous to a psychotic experience, and wanted to understand psychosis through this experience in healthy volunteers, and especially in people who are better able to describe the experience because they have either a clinical perspective or they have a literary sensibility. And the two instructors who were teaching the seminar on self-experimentation mentioned that there was research again going on in Germany on psychedelics. That was actually a group around Leo Hermle, which had inherited the stash of mescaline that Behringer had still worked with. And they were doing neuroscience experiments with this mescaline, and then later DMT and psilocybin and some other substances. And so I had some LSD experiences in high school, and was extremely fascinated by these experiences. I had read a lot about psychopharmacology at that time, about sort of medicinal chemistry work that had led to the invention of LSD by Albert Hoffman. And for me, that was a moment when several things came together. So partly it seemed like a good project to continue with after the work on psychoanalysis. I was done with psychoanalysis because I had done some sort of quasi field work among Berlin Lacanian psychoanalysts, and I found their sectarianism absolutely unbearable. And I was sure after that dissertation that I would not become a psychoanalyst. Um, but the psychedelic experiences have a lot of psychological depth. And in fact, psychedelics have been used to assist with psychoanalytic and other depth psychological forms of psychotherapy. Um, and at the same time, they were biological interventions. And my interest in neuroscience was piqued by that. So I was very excited about discovering the what's now known as the psychedelic renaissance. Um, and I started to design a research project around that. And it could not be or well, it could have been in history of science, but given that there was a ongoing revival that nobody was looking at, and I also prefer doing field work to doing archival work. Um, I thought I'd go to the US and pursue this ethnographically.
So when you came to Berkeley to work on, so you decided to work on psychedelics before coming
Yeah.
to Berkeley. And when you came to do it, were there others in the program there or in similar programs across the US doing this kind of work, or were you at the sort of beginning
On
point
psychedelics?
on psychedelics? Yeah.
There was very little on psychedelics at the time. Erika Dick is a historian of medicine who was already working on the history of psychedelic psychiatry, but that work focused on Canada in the 50s and 60s.
Hmm.
And I was not aware of that at that point. The book came out maybe in 2008, I think, when I was already done with my fieldwork. There was a literary scholar, um, Doyle, who was working on psychedelic literature, like Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna and so on, from a literary theory point of view. Um, but that was pretty much it, and there was nobody working on the Renaissance ethnographically.
So of course, I'm of an age where I went to college and was part of the youth culture, I suppose, in a more in a general sense, when the first major psychedelic uh, set of experiences took place, and it was obviously an important part of understanding youth culture, and of course many of the things that happened in the cultural in the cultural moment of the 1960s and early 70s. But of course, a combination of things led to a sense that the enthusiasm about psychedelics had been excessive. There were many people who obviously came on and had normal lives as a result of it, but there were people whose lives were disrupted by the use of psychedelics, to say the least. And the image of the summer of love, began to be inverted so that it seemed like a very dark kind of moment in the history of self-medicalization. Uh, as you're describing it, when you began to do your work in the graduate program at Berkeley, you were at the kind of cutting edge of a moment where psychedelics were beginning to come back into medical use, but in a very different kind of way. First, around, as you were saying it, experimentations in neuroscience and efforts to understand the biological intervention that psychedelic substances caused in the brain, with other kinds of studies that were taking place at the time around the brain. But but in the last 15 years or so, it seems to me there's been a whole new uh, revival of not just the use, but also the recognition, or at least the hope, that psychedelics could be used in ways that would simultaneously be of great help for a variety of psychiatric ailments, but also potentially other uses as well, at the same time that a kind of growing interest, albeit in a very different way at a very different time, began to be associated with a number of psychedelic substances. So when do you date the beginning of this kind of new phase of interest in, and how would you characterize how it began and how it took off?
So the psychedelic renaissance really began in the 1990s already,
I see.
which means that the gap was actually not that long. The
Hmm.
research was terminated uh, or petered out in the late 60s, early 70s. And then 20 years later, there was already a resumption of activity, such as the German group in the US at about the same time, all around 1990. There was Rick Strassman, who did a DMT trial with human subjects at the University of New Mexico, I think. Um, there was the activism on the part of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies,
Hmm.
which is one of the big drivers of the current work in the US, certainly, but also globally. So all of that basically begins in the 90s. What you're referring to in the past 15 years is basically the resumption of clinical trials. And of course, the clinical trials have drawn a lot more public attention. And then in 2017, 18, 19, the FDA declared first MDMA-assisted therapy and then psilocybin-assisted therapy, and by now also LSD-assisted therapy, breakthrough therapies. So that means the market approval process is expedited based on promising data. Drugs that are on the breakthrough therapy path still only have a 50% approval chance, which is significantly higher than for your regular drug that's being evaluated by the FDA. But many people, I think, have taken this as like a done deal at that point, which isn't true. But there was a startup industry that emerged around this. Then Michael Pollan wrote his book, How to Change Your Mind, which became a New York Times bestseller. So 2018 was probably like the watershed year when the psychedelic renaissance really came to be perceived widely in the American public. You were asking about the difference between the psychedelic renaissance and the heyday of psychedelic culture in the 50s and 60s. Um, I think the main difference is that the proponents of the psychedelic renaissance very self-consciously fashioned their endeavor as a break with the counterculture. So uh, the youth culture and the public health problems that came with it were part of the issue. The other part was that psychedelics came to be politicized in the 60s. They were associated with anti-Vietnam protests, with anti-capitalism, with all sorts of anarchic, left-wing, libertarian, often utopian political projects. And at least part of the backlash was to that, to
Hmm.
psychedelics becoming a symbol of this rebellion against, the American way of life as it was perceived and against the establishment. And the proponents of the psychedelic renaissance very deliberately tried to steer clear of that, uh, in part by making it a scientific project.
Right.
So the 1990s were also the decade that President Bush, the father, had announced as the decade of the brain. And many people were interested in the neurobiology of consciousness. So this new generation of psychedelic researchers who had come of age in the 60s and 70s and who at that point were running their own labs and had some ability to decide what they wanted to work on, presented their pet drugs as, drugs that alter consciousness biologically. So if you want to understand the neurobiology of consciousness, studying the effects of psychedelics on the human brain is the obvious way to go. Um, there was a little bit of a revival of model psychosis research. So that was what Kurt Behringer had done in the 1920s.
Hmm.
And for complicated reasons that have to do with the changing conceptualizations of schizophrenia, there was an opening for that again. And people were making the case that psychedelics could teach us something about this, which was strategically smart because it didn't suggest that psychedelics were anything good. They cause psychosis, if only temporarily, but you would be able to get money from, for example, NIDA for this kind of research. Um, and the clinical prospect was present. There were definitely people around from the get-go who thought that psychedelics might have some medical potential, but it wasn't clear at all.
So in the 90s, there wasn't, I mean, this was largely driven by
Basic
efforts to
research.
understand basic research in neuroscience
Yeah.
and to see if psychedelic drugs could help shed light on both the nature of consciousness, but also basic mental processes and the
And
relationship between
psychosis. So
psychosis and, yeah.
experimental psychiatry, but the idea was not to treat psychotics with psychedelics,
But to identify
to understand
and understand.
the neurobiology underlying psychotic processes. Yeah.
And this is early days in neuroscience in some respects because MRI technology is still very preliminary.
Well,
It's
PET scanning, I think, was a major driver in the decade of the brain. The reason why the neurosciences came to be hyped in the way they were in the 1990s was that PET scans started to produce colorful images of the brain at work. And fMRI sort of starts coming in, but happens later. The
happens
90s
mostly
work is more
later. Yeah.
like PET scanning. Um, but and the lab in Zurich where I did the bulk of my field work was a lab for neuropsychopharmacology and brain imaging. So the PET lab was kind of the centerpiece of that lab.
So in your actual dissertation, you focused on 2 or 3 labs that did this work?
I focused on 2 labs. The one in Zurich, which was the most important lab for human experimentation at the time, partly because the Swiss regulatory context was a lot more liberal in that respect. And they were collaborating with an animal lab at the University of California in San Diego, run by Mark Geyer, which was using psychedelics in rodents also as a model of psychosis to screen for new antipsychotic drugs.
But then you were alluding to the beginning, which comes later, of the idea that that psychedelics could be used for more than just experimentation in understanding the brain, but it could potentially have positive medical benefits. And when do you date that? And how do you see the origins of the kind of medicalization, before the Michael Pollan books and so on and so forth, but the early stages of the medicalization of psychedelic treatment as something that begins to animate the world of biomedical research?
The medicalization of psychedelics already began in the 50s, 60s.
Goes back to that. Yeah.
Sandoz, where Albert Hoffman had discovered LSD, was looking for a medical application of LSD at the time. There were a number of trials. Of course, the Canadians were using mescaline and LSD to treat alcoholism. That was a
Hmm.
big part of 1960s research on psychedelics. Um, I think an interesting part of that story is that uh, the 1960s were the time when randomized placebo-controlled trials became the gold standard of pharmacological research.
Hmm.
And in 1959, there was an anthropologist called Anthony Wallace who happened to be running a research unit of a psychiatric hospital, which happened to be doing some LSD research. And he published a very interesting paper at the time in which he suggested that placebo-controlled trials should be supplemented by culture-controlled trials, because he had some experience with the use of mescaline in Native American cultures, and there was a long-standing observation dating back to the late 19th century, when first mescaline research started, that the experiences of white test subjects in experimental psychology lab with mescaline differed significantly from the experiences that Native Americans had in their peyote ceremonies in a religious context. So the context dependence of psychedelic effects had basically been addressed from the get-go.
Hmm.
And so Wallace suggested so yes, we should be looking at what the drug is doing, but we should also run trials where uh, both conditions administer the drug at the same dosage, and we vary a different component, such as ethnicity of the subject or their religious beliefs, or you cue them social psychologically, or sort of have some sort of extra pharmacological factor that you're varying. And that became completely marginalized in psychopharmacology. You can trace a sort of history of this marginal practice. So in the 70s, for example, there was a psychopharmacologist called Bruce Alexander who did the famous Red Park experiment, where he was administering addictive substances like opiates or stimulants to rats, and to assess their addictive potential. And the standard way in which this was done was that the rats were kept in plexiglass boxes and were isolated and had like a completely kind of socially and deprived life. And then he created a rat park where they were living with other rats. They had places to exercise. They could have sex with their fellow rats. They could explore stuff. They had like an entire like little Disney world for rats, basically. And they could also self-administer opiates or stimulants. And their interest in self-administration was significantly reduced compared with the other situation. Um, so, there has been an interest in contextual factors in psychopharmacology, but it has always been marginalized. And uh, the medical historian Matthew Oram wrote a book about this early period of psychedelic research in which he argues that psychedelics did not fare well in the 60s because there was an increasing demand that they prove their mettle in randomized placebo-controlled trials. And because contextual factors are so important in this, that didn't work. And the placebo-controlled trials basically did not show them to be effective medicines. And I think one interesting question is the breakthrough therapy designation that FDA gave to psychedelics was based on randomized placebo-controlled trials. Um, so it's a little bit unclear what has happened there. One hypothesis would be, even though contextual factors weren't evaluated in a controlled trial, as Wallace had proposed, um, researchers were highly aware of that. And I mean, I can attest to that. Whoever I spoke to in the psychedelic neuroscience labs, they knew very, very well that they had to manage set and setting carefully um, if they wanted the research to work out. And so there might be a deliberate work with these contextual factors that just doesn't show up in the research papers. And this is something that also came up now when FDA and last year, last summer, rejected market approval of MDMA-assisted therapy. One of the issues that came up was that there were concerns about the therapy practices that went along with this. There was mistrust in the data because the contextual factors played such a big role and at the same time were not controlled for.
So the FDA approval was rejected. Do you think it's going to, at some point, get FDA approval? And
I think that's a
are some of
totally
these contextual factors now being, sort of put into the mix in a way that can actually be evaluated and parsed in ways that would help make the case for these kinds of therapeutic uses?
so in the 2010s, uh, neuropsychopharmacologists grew more interested in the contextual factors. So you find a number of papers in scientific journals that address the importance of context and that speculate about why it might be that psychedelics are particularly context sensitive. And I think that actually is an open question. Are they really more context sensitive? What would be the neurobiological mechanism for this context sensitivity? And if they're not exceptional in that respect, then what implications does that have for other psychopharmacological substances such as antidepressants or stimulants or antipsychotics? There has not been a major paradigm shift. I would argue that the paradigm of psychopharmacology continues to be randomized placebo-controlled trials. FDA assesses data from randomized placebo-controlled trials. They made it very clear that it's not their business to assess the role of psychotherapy in these trials. That's a big problem because the applicant for MDMA approval had argued explicitly that it is not simply the MDMA that is therapeutic. Otherwise, you would see like lots of spontaneous recoveries from PTSD after every rave where people take ecstasy. Their argument was that it is the combination of MDMA with a psychotherapeutic practice.
And the FDA just has trouble evaluating
They,
these
they, they don't have
extra.
a mandate. They would need Congress to change their mandate. They cannot simply approve or disapprove of a psychotherapy because they have been tasked to take care of drug safety and not
Right.
psychotherapy.
But of course, there's increasing evidence across the whole field of neuropharmacology that drugs alone have been far less useful and helpful in most respects than either claims that have been made about them or hopes that have been invested in them. And if indeed it is the case with so much that, of course, concerns the brain, that it is both about chemistry and about, just for want of a better word, context, that is to say, a whole variety of extra biological factors that become entwined with and hard to separate from, certainly, the biological processes, then as long as the FDA refuses or is unable to evaluate these other kinds of factors, does this suggest that progress in terms of actual pharmacological treatments of psychiatric disorders is going to continue to be, kicked down the road?
I think it's a very serious question about the regulatory system, right? I mean, the regulatory system. I think that there needs to be an epistemological debate about how one would go about studying this. So the culture control trials are one
Hmm.
proposal. I think there could be other ways of going about this. And then there is a question of what do we make of this in regulatory terms? Um, it it I don't think that there is any easy answer to it, but I do think that we need a discussion about this. I think so. You asked, will these approvals are these approvals still coming? Um, I think the answer is we really don't know.
Yeah.
So the case for psilocybin-assisted therapies was not as strong as the one for MDMA-assisted therapies. If you look at the clinical data, so far no regulatory agency had to decide about market approval for psilocybin. We'll see whether that's going to happen. Uh, the MDMA data for post-traumatic stress disorder looked stronger, but got a lot of pushback. Now we have a completely different political situation in the US compared with last summer. Um, RFK Jr. Is in charge of the Department of Health. He said very clearly last year already that bringing psychedelics to the market would be one of his priorities. So MAPS was the activist organization, which originally understood itself as a non-profit pharmaceutical corporation. By now, they have turned into a for-profit pharmaceutical corporation because they realized that they can't afford phase 3 trials without investors. So the company now is called Lykos, and that's the company that is submitting the application. Lykos, of course, got into deep financial trouble after the rejection. One of the people who are considering to give Lykos financial backing for a second attempt is an investor called Antonio Gracias, who's also given $16 million to Harvard to set up a Psychedelics and Society Center. And this is somebody who is close with Elon Musk. So if he were to take over Lycos, and then Lycos would basically submit another application. There would at least be a different kind of political will um, uh, in supporting such an application. And I think this is another part of the psychedelic renaissance having moved away from the counterculture. So MAPS, from the start, very deliberately created bipartisan support for psychedelics by focusing on post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis that many veterans and
So this was
policemen
do you
suffer
think it was
from.
a deliberate political
Yes,
decision?
absolutely. It was a deliberate decision,
So
and
rather than focusing, say, on depression or on
yeah,
other kinds of psychiatric
yeah.
disorders.
The goal was to focus on something that would create bipartisan
Hmm.
support. And I mean, Rick Doblin accepted donations from Rebecca Mercer. Breitbart News was kind of very enthusiastic about MDMA getting the breakthrough therapy designation. Partly because there were veterans who had, you know, broken out of of a whole series of suicide attempts after having been treated in one of the MAPS programs, who would then go and talk to their Republican representatives and tell them how much they had benefited from this. So, I mean, the really interesting part about the sort of psychedelic renaissance is that, in this hyper polarized political environment, psychedelics were one of the very, very few topics that received several bipartisan bills in Congress. I don't think any of them ever went through, but there was bipartisan support for these bills. Like,
Yeah, so this is quite extraordinary. I mean, you begin in the 50s and 60s with a sense, at least, that psychedelics are associated not just with anarchism and counterculture and all the rest of it, but but the political left, let's just say, in a kind of broad stroke. And even if it's now bipartisan, the story you're just telling is one in which certainly important right-wing figures and institutions like Breitbart and the like are driving forward potentially an approval process for psychedelics. Uh, and in an odd way, what you're also describing is that one of the kinds of points of I think crisis around science has been about its development under a kind of assumption that that science is about something physical, something in this case biological, and yet in a context in which we know from our own experience and we know from a great deal of social scientific work that context, as you put it, will change all kinds of things, and that at the very least, biology is entwined with and entangled with the non-biological kinds of factors, causes, and surround issues that affect all mental activity and indeed all behavior. And we're learning about this in all different kinds of ways. So you're looking at a situation in which the changing political regime might actually lead to a peculiar, almost counterintuitive kind of outcome.
the established FDA procedure of focusing almost exclusively on randomized placebo-controlled trials might not fit psychedelics well. So there are good reasons to break up this sort of technocratic uh, um, procedure that had been created around this. And obviously, there is enough iconoclasts in the current Trump administration and around RFK Jr. in particular, who would be willing to do that. Uh, I'm also talking to psychedelic researchers who are absolutely horrified by that because they see psilocybin becoming the next ivermectin. And if it gets market approval in a way that is not perceived as proper by the biological psychiatry establishment, who are already looking at psychedelics with, a little bit of suspicion, um, then this will be a mark of disdain for the rest of these substances' lives, and it will be, it could produce like a extremely negative
Yeah, it could
reputational
backfire in
effect.
big ways. So, Nick, I'm going to have to call things to a close since we're out of time, but we obviously have to bring you back to another Shaping Science podcast so we can continue to explore both the strange twists and turns of the history of psychedelics and medical treatment. And we didn't even get to talking about questions around chimpanzee wars and some of the other work you've done of a comparative kind. That also raises a lot of questions about the social studies of science. So we'll continue, hopefully, this conversation at another
Yeah,
time
would be a
soon.
pleasure.
But thank you so much for joining us today. And this wraps up this episode of Shaping Science. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again for future episodes. To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.